Thank you, Mr. Miyamoto, and thank you, Tina. Now, I said we had 2 more examples of the future of portable gaming for you today. And here's the second. Now, I know you haven't seen this. It's Gameboy Micro.
In short, the Game Boy Micro is a handheld that a lot of casual Nintendo fans never know about. Not only considered to be a financial failure, but most people revere the console as an uncomfortable, lackluster piece of the Game Boy line. The late Satoru Iwata explained to Nintendo investors like this: "The sales of the Micro did not meet our expectations. The Micro showed different sales in and outside of Japan. Inside Japan, initial sales of the Micro were rather good and it did become a hot topic, so there was a possibility for this product to grow in Japan. However, toward the end of 2005, Nintendo had to focus almost all of our energy on the marketing of the DS, which must have deprived the Micro of its momentum. With the Micro being on retail shelves after its eventual successor, the Nintendo DS, it became clear very quickly that the public was looking for a new generation to enjoy." During the development of the Game Boy Micro, codenamed Oxy, then Vice President of Nintendo George Harrison had this to say about the development of the Game Boy line as a whole. Quote, "The Game Boy is in continuous process of invention, looking at all sorts of ideas. The idea for a small Game Boy came maybe about 2 years ago, and we refined it to the point where it really felt like it could have a place. It's a little bit more image focused and maybe more appropriate for some of the people who are more casual gamers now." End quote. To support this philosophy, the late Satoru Iwata admitted the metal casing was unusual for Nintendo, backing up the claim that Harrison made in trying new ideas for the Game Boy line. The future of this ambitious attempt of their new Game Boy innovation would be foreshadowed during the internal development of Nintendo's new truly tiny trinket. This was touched upon in former president of Nintendo Reggie Fils-Aimé's new book titled Disrupting the Game. In the chapter Courageous Decisions, Reggie discusses the preparation of making the Nintendo DS a long-term success. According to Mr. Fils-Aimé, quote, "Nintendo of America was planning on closing out the Game Boy Advance line with a Black Friday promotion that would clear out all of our inventory." End quote. Nintendo of America had made these plans in early 2005, where at this point Reggie describes he was still unaware of the Micro's development directly under his own nose. The former president continued to express his distaste for the console and how his first impressions were not very good. As he explains in detail himself, the control buttons were difficult for any reasonably sized adult to manipulate, but also the screen was tiny. After development was complete, this miniature powerhouse held a 32-bit processor, a beautiful 2-inch display with 5 levels of adjustable brightness, and a 240 by 160 pixel display. With a rechargeable lithium-ion battery, this metal Micro could fetch about 5 hours of gameplay on the highest brightness settings, or 8 hours on the default screen brightness. It was also the return of the headphone jack, which was discarded in the previous Game Boy Advance SP models. Furthermore, you could individually swap faceplates to change the look of your console. However, this large step forward in the image of the Micro wasn't nearly enough to distract the public from a few major gripes against this hardware. In particular, this revision of the Game Boy Advance line was not backwards compatible, nor were you able to use existing link cables for local multiplayer games. The biggest problem, however, was the inclusion of an entirely new proprietary charging cable for the system, which would only be used for the Micro. These were serious concerns for the Micro going into the release day of a brand new system, but several media outlets were huge fans of the Micro. As an article from PC Mag reads, "For teens and adult gamers on the go, however, the Micro is the best choice, especially for someone who wants the smallest portable gaming platform that is not a cell phone. It doesn't have the graphics performance of the DS or the PSP, but at $99.95, it is much cheaper than either one of them." While others, like Ken Fishers from Ars Technica, was disappointed about the price tag being $20 more than the previous model's $79 price tag. All of this mixed reception would lead to one of the biggest North American release date disappointments in Nintendo's long history. The Game Boy Micro had a formal release date of September 19, 2005. The handheld's first launch months in North America were short of Nintendo of Japan's ambitious imagination. As mentioned before, Mr. Iwata had claimed to have great initial sales in the home region of the Hanafuda the Handheld company, but its first few days in the Americas weren't nearly as successful as they would have hoped. Allegedly, retailers had ignored the Micro's intended release and stalled to order the Micro until an astounding 11 days after its formal release date. Not being released in Europe until November 5th, 2005, the Game Boy Micro would have only sold 700,000 units worldwide by September 30th. After being released in Europe, the Micro would accrue a worldwide 1.82 million units by the end of 2005. Reviews on the Micro at the time were all generally positive, vouching for the Micro even through its cons. For example, Nix wrote for IGN in August of 2005, quote, "Although there are obvious drawbacks to playing the Micro rather than a more comfortable Game Boy Advance SP or a standard Game Boy Advance, the Game Boy Micro is a handy little gadget to have, and is plenty capable as a game machine even at its diminutive size." A lot of reviews at the time praised the Game Boy Micro, and the Nintendo World Report Vincent Anderson even scored the Micro a 9 out of 10. Most of its praise stemmed from the same few subjects: the form factor, the customization, the surprising comfortability of it, the headphone jack, but most importantly, the screen. Most reviewers were keen on immediately clearing up that the Game Boy Micro was, contrary to consumer concerns, easy to see details and read text. Scott Steinberg of the 2005 Digital Trends article wrote that the Game Boy Micro quashes that gossip right out of the gate, and that the shrunken form of these games enhances the experiences rather than hinders them. In another review from Ars Technica, Ben Kuchera puts an extreme emphasis on what he thinks people want to hear the most: the quality of the screen. In the section titled "I Got 99 Problems But Reading Text Ain't One," Kuchera explains that at that time, the Game Boy Micro screen blew him away so much it trumped anything that Nintendo has put out up until that date. Unfortunately, these highs of the Micro have lows as well, which can all mostly be summed up in a few components. The terrible sound quality combined with the fragility and easy to dirty faceplates was not enough to really put the nail in the coffin. The factor that put this tiny handheld to bed was its price point. At $99.99, the Micro was in very, very awkward territory. Going back to Mr. Steinberg's Digital Trends review, he sums it up better than any other reviewer did. Quote, "If you own any earlier model, an upgrade is very hard to justify, considering the unit does essentially the same things. Likewise, a Game Boy Advance SP costs only $79.79. Distant cousin and Nintendo DS is capable of playing all Game Boy Advance cartridges as well as the original DS games too. It costs only $30 more." During its lifespan of just 3 years, the Game Boy Micro would show its fate at an early age. The Micro sold only 2.43 million units all time, while at the same point, in just 40 days, the Nintendo DS would sell 2.84 million units, outselling the Game Boy Micro in just those 40 days alone. The DS would quickly shove this little handheld to the wayside. However, this isn't the whole story. The Micro had huge video game releases during its lifetime, multiple beautiful variations, and is slowly manipulating the views of the failed machine into that of a portable, comfortable classic. An important note to start off with is that although the family of Game Boy Advances are quite old at this point, the family of handhelds were completely supported until about 2005. But right before the launch of the DS and a year and a half from the Micro, a huge game that got everyone interested in Game Boy Advances again was on September 16th, 2004. Pokemon Emerald was an absolute powerhouse of a title that would recreate a new story for you and Hoenn, plus it would get a new player interested in the last Pokemon title in the Game Boy Advance series of games. Keeping this in mind, what else was on the store shelves for a new player to get their hands on? A lot of the main series titles that any new player should have are readily available, like the Super Mario Advance series of games, The Legend of Zelda Minish Cap, Mario vs. Donkey Kong, Mario Kart Super Circuit. But not only were these essential titles available, but new ones too. The aforementioned Pokemon Emerald, Yoshi's Topsy Turvy, Mario Party Advance, the Mega Man Battle Network 5, Donkey Kong King of Swing, and Donkey Kong Country 3. But what new games were coming out to keep the system alive and well? We had a lot of good games on the shelf, but if a player wanted a brand new experience, what were they to expect? Starting first with the callbacks to the Famicom limited edition faceplate was available at launch, adding a little something extra to the players who wanted their Micro to just be that much sleeker. During this launch window, Nintendo was trying to incentivize customers to buy a Micro by promoting a special faceplate on the Club Nintendo website. By registering both Super Robot Wars J and a silver Game Boy Micro, You could then receive a Club Nintendo exclusive Robot Wars faceplate. Similarly, through just normal point earning, you could save enough to buy the Player 2 Famicom controller styled faceplate as well. Then, in October 2005, Square Enix had jumped in and released a special Final Fantasy themed Game Boy Micro for the RPG fans to carry around with them. Bundled with the game, new Micro players could enjoy the Super Famicom remake while out and about. In both Japan and North America, to complement the latest game, Pokemon Centers in New York and Tokyo both sold an exclusive Game Boy Micro with a silhouette of Pikachu on the front faceplate. Finally, on April 20th, 2006, a huge game was released in Japan with the continuation of the beloved Mother series. Bundled with a brand new Mother 3 Game Boy Micro and a copy of the game, players could play as Lucas trying to avenge his brother and murdered mother. Trying to get Micros of all different types into the pockets of fans proved difficult, as these huge franchises weren't enough to lift this last Game Boy handheld out of its own grave. And finally, with no more retail variations, the last Game Boy Advance game was released on February 12, 2008, marking the end of an era. In retrospect, the Game Boy Micro is still looked at as a novelty. The original fashion statement Nintendo was trying to make with this console still sticks to this day. But I wanted to turn to the rest of the internet to truly get a grasp on how Nintendo enthusiasts thought about this controversial piece of Nintendo's history. To begin, a YouTuber by the name of Max Does Tech reviewed the Game Boy Micro in the middle of 2021, when a resurgence of popularity for the compact console was on the downfall. In this video, Max had gone over the striking beauty of this console, highlighting its beautiful screen, metal case, and a wonderful feel of the miniature powerhouse. In 2021, Max left a positive review of the work of art that was created at the end of a beautiful era. Moving back a little bit further to the beginning of 2020, Elliot Cole of the Retro Future created a small dedication to the Game Boy Micro and pointed out an enormous advantage to playing a Game Boy Micro in the modern day. While back in 2005 you weren't able to play the original Game Boy or Game Boy Color games on the console, Game Boy Advance shaped cartridges named Flash Cards would do the job for you. Flash cartridges are able to convert the original Game Boy and Game Boy Color games over to a Game Boy Advance sized cartridge, allowing the console to play the games. Elliot was adamant to highlight how deceivingly comfortable the system is to hold and to play for extended periods of time. Finishing it off with a quick reminder that the Game Boy Micros are not cheap by any stretch of the imagination, being the most expensive variation of the Game Boy line by a considerable margin. A wonderful way to sum up the Game Boy Micro in the current day is by referencing Scott the Waz's Game Boy Advance Power to the Pocket video, where he remarks if you find it for a cheap price, go for it. After listing similar gripes to the two previously mentioned videos, Scott adds that he had fallen in love with the console because of its glaring beauty and screen. When combining these three videos from 3 separate years, we can see that most of the fans in the current day have similar things to say about it. The beautiful form factor and screen combine to create a wonderfully imperfect console. Although expensive, you can make up for the lack of backwards compatibility through the modern means of a flash cartridge. Now, my first handheld was a Game Boy Advance SP. Although I was only around 5, I don't even really recollect any memories pertaining to the Micro itself. No advertisements anywhere, none on the shelves, and none even in Kmart, Toys R Us, Target, or even Walmart Christmas papers. But after growing through my life and starting to pick up game collecting, I noticed the Game Boy Micro and was immediately intrigued by the beauty of this thing. The sleek and shiny feel, but it was also compact enough for me to carry to and from work or school. And after receiving my first Game Boy Micro at age 20, I kind of felt a little bit confused by the thing. I remember holding it and just wondering how I was going to play it. It barely fit in my hands, and I put it on my shelf and just looked at it for a little while. And then I started collecting more Game Boy Advance games as time went on, and then I kind of acquired enough to be able to justify carrying such an expensive Game Boy Advance around, and I turned it on, and I was just completely enthralled by the screen's pixel-perfect display and how well the shoulder buttons could melt into my index fingers. But it's a perfect console in my eyes at that time. But after a year of carrying this thing around went by, and I had adopted a new favorite console, what I consider to be the murderer of the Micro for me. An IPS screen inside of original Game Boy Advance was a far more superior console, and by a large margin as well. Unfortunately, for the subject of this video, the Micro is completely outclassed by this IPS GBA. Not only can I play cartridges that I couldn't on the Micro, but I don't have to worry about accidentally scratching the original GBA either. Although the IPS Game Boy Advance is a much more practical device to carry around every day, nothing can really compare to the wonderful memories I shared on the Mother 3 Game Boy Micro that I carried around for what seemed like decades. Not only a meaningful console for me as a collector, but as a mother and Nintendo enthusiast, its significance to Nintendo's history would be anything but micro to me.